order. Hearing is now resumed.
Good morning, Commissioner Cohen. For the record, Brian Wallace, Senior Commission Counsel, and with me are Patrick McGowan and Jennifer Chan. Yesterday, we ended talking about the costs associated with regulating the aquaculture industry, and this is in the context of continuing testimony about the financial pressures on DFO. And I'm not sure I have an answer to this question. Perhaps, Ms. Dansrow, you could tell me the answer. Is there or will there be a cost charged to members of the aquaculture industry for aquaculture licenses?
That is something that we're currently working on.
What order of magnitude are these licenses going to cost?
As I said, that's something that we're working on right now. We don't have an answer.
When will you have an answer?
Within the next, within the next year or two.
Is it the intention of DFO that the cost of regulating aquaculture will be covered by the cost of licenses?
We are, in fact, looking at, I think everybody knows, the entire structure of our license fees for all of our fisheries, and those are the kinds of questions that we're asking for the wild fishery as much as we would be asking for the aquaculture side.
So you're looking at this in connection with what you charge for licenses for commercial fishing, for example?
Yes.
We've had some questions in the aquaculture hearings about the perception that DFO may be in a position of divided loyalties between its obligations and its to the aquaculture industry and its obligations to the wild fishery. And in particular, the question is whether the promotion of the aquaculture industry is in conflict with the obligations to the wild salmon fishery. So my question for you, Ms. Dansrow, as a Deputy Minister, do you agree with that perception that there are divided loyalties between those two obligations?
The perception exists. I recognize that. I don't agree that we have divided loyalties. I believe that we are doing our job as regulators both of the wild fishery and of the aquaculture fishery. That we view both as fisheries, as the courts have described, and it's our responsibility to both regulate and promote both of them.
In promoting, it's really the issue of promoting that's concerned. I understand why you regulate the aquaculture industry, and my interest is more about the promotion of that industry. And I understand that DFO has spent some money, substantial amounts of money recently to promote that industry internationally, to seek international investment in it. Has comparable promotion been done in the commercial salmon fishery?
We don't seek international investment. We do not. We are not an arm of the industry, but we do attend international seafood shows either in Boston or in Brussels and other places to assist the industry showcase its products. We do that for both the wild fishery and the aquaculture fishery. Yes. We believe our responsibility on the issue of promotion has more to do with ensuring there is market access for Canadian products, and aquaculture products are Canadian products as much as the products of the wild fisheries are. So we treat both parts equally.
Has Canada considered the possibility of separating the promotion of both wild salmon and aquaculture from the regulation, and perhaps putting that in industry or trade?
We don't do, I want to be careful with the language here, we don't do marketing. We are not the marketing side of the industry. We provide we assist with market access. We make sure that international doors are open and that Canadian products have a way to move into other markets. So our work in that regard is quite minimal. One area that some may say we are involved in promoting is by working with industry to ensure that our fisheries are MSC certified or third-party certified in some way. That could be seen to be part of promotion, but in fact it's also part of management, and so sometimes the two go together.
My question was, has there been consideration of dividing these two functions?
Well, it depends. Again, it comes back to the definition of the functions. The functions are, if we're thinking about marketing, going out and doing advertising campaigns to buy Canada, we don't do that. That's already divided. Agriculture Canada has a program for that. But our job is to show the world that the Canadian products are safe. Canadian products are sustainable. And that's because we are the regulators, and we can speak with a certain amount of authority on those areas, and that's the extent of our involvement.
And another issue of priorities has been raised with respect to the nature of scientific research that the department chooses to spend its limited resources on. And we've heard several times that when it comes to choosing what disease research to do, there's been a focus more on captive fish, farm fish, or hatchery fish than there has on wild fish. And this has been mentioned in one of our technical reports, Michael Kent's report on infectious diseases, where he says most research on salmonid diseases has been directed toward those afflicting captive fish, either in government hatcheries or private fish farms. Is it fair to say that DFO's research and monitoring efforts in terms of infectious disease continue to be weighted towards research on captive fish as opposed to wild fish?
I think that question is best addressed to Dr. Richards.
Thank you. Dr. Richards?
Yes, good morning. In answer to that question, I'd have to say that our priorities for research are very much weighted by the need for us to provide advice. So in the context of working on fish disease, we are working together, and one of our major clients in terms of the provision of science advice is the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, who are the leaders in our National Aquatic Animal Health Program. And so we, given that obviously we have limited resources to spend on things like research, we do look for direction, and we work with them to identify priorities. We also work with our clients or others in the department, including those in fisheries management and those responsible for aquaculture management, to help us identify the priorities. So yes, I think it's true that given the focus has really been on the issues around the fish which are caught in fisheries and which we use in hatcheries, that has been the focus of our research.
I'm sorry, Dr. Richards, you said the focus is the fish that are caught in fisheries and the fish that are...
Our focus has been on the support of our fishery managers and the fishery managers and aquaculture managers. So the fishery managers being largely interested in fish which are available to fisheries. And so that has been really the focus. I think more recently we've had let's say an expansion of our mandate into a broader ecosystem approach. And that's really, I think, raising much broader questions about the general health. We have, in fact, started to do some studies on looking more generically at the health of fish. We do have funding a project which was started last year in 2010 to look more synoptically at the health of juvenile salmonids in the Strait of Georgia. And that was a project that we just started last year. So we have realized, we are aware that there's a gap. We have taken what opportunities we have to try to address that through some additional opportunities when we have those opportunities. But yes, the focus has been on, I think the focus as stated by Dr. Kent in his report is correct.
Okay. I'd like to ask some questions, and Dr. Richards, I think you're going to have a lot of these directed at you and perhaps at you, Ms. Fralinger, because it's a lot about science, but we certainly will hear, I'm sure, from the Deputy Minister and the Associate Deputy Minister as well. One of the issues that we've heard about are the risk of science programs because of lack of funds, and one of the at-risk issues is test fishing, and the issue of the expiration of LAROC funding in March of 2012. Paul Ryle testified in January that there are no plans or proposals in place to his knowledge for how test fishing would be funded once these funds are gone. Have you made a decision on whether or not you will carry on LAROC funding? And this is to you, Ms. Dansero.
Thank you for the question. The answer is similar to the answer I gave yesterday on PICFI funding, which is 5-year programs are not, it's not determined at the outset whether or not they will end on a certain date or continue after the 5 years. We are in the process right now of an evaluation to determine whether or not all elements of the LAROC funding should be renewed, and therefore we would go seek renewal. Don't know if we would receive it or not, or if some parts of it could be let go and other parts continue to be funded. So I don't have an answer. It's the same answer I gave yesterday, and we can't predict the outcome.
And this is an event that will occur 6 months from now if there's no decision made to renew it.
Yes.
And my questions are similar to the questions about PICFI. How are you going about evaluating this to make an appropriate decision, as I say, given that it has to be made within 6 months?
We have in the department an evaluation team. We have both an audit team and an evaluation team, and they are practiced at evaluating programs. There's a framework that they use, and there are modalities that they measure, and then that goes up through our evaluation committee, and the evaluation committee will make some recommendations as to whether or not the program ought to be continued or not. That also then gets reviewed by an external audit committee that looks at, they're not officially required to look at our evaluations, but they do take a look at them to determine whether or not the process and the methodology were adequate. So that's a standard process for us in all of our programs.
Paul Ryle's evidence on this was pretty black and white, and I'm wondering how difficult this decision really is. He says that the test fishing is integral to gathering in-season information, and it was so important that without this information we would be, I would not say totally blind, but we would be missing how we would conduct fisheries in season and make decisions to manage these fisheries. That's a pretty stark observation. How hard is this to make a decision on continuing it?
I can't speak to that. I think that most people would say that test fishing is important, and I can't presuppose what the outcome of the evaluation will be, but evidence such as that would obviously be included, but we would need to get real evidence as to the value. And if the evidence is there, then we will do what we can to find ways to fund it.
This, the LAROC decision was some time ago, and the funding was put in place, I think, for 5 years. And here we are near the end. I suppose one might ask why so close to the end this is left as a concern and no decision made yet.
It's standard process. All sunsetting programs go through a Treasury Board approval process, and that happens at the end of the 5 years. It's just standard government procedure, and the evaluation occurs in the final year because we can look back and determine what the value of the program or its subparts were.
Will this determination be for long-term funding, stable funding for the test fishery?
Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Generally, sunsetters carry on being sunsetting type programs. Sometimes ministers decide that the work itself is valuable enough that it should continue and become stable long-term funding. But the approach, as we discussed yesterday, of reviewing activities on a 5-year basis is a reasonable approach for any organization, and so there's no harm really in taking a look every 5 years to see that the monies are being well spent and spent in the right places on the right priorities.
Ms. Frelinger, will your advice to head office be that this funding should be continued and put on a long-term stable basis?
We certainly participate in the evaluation process in the region, and it's certainly our view that in the absence of those test fisheries, we would need to have strategies and alternatives in place to manage the fishery that would provide us with adequate information to manage it. But all of that information will be evaluated as part of the ongoing.
And so you would agree with Mr. Grout that this is a fundamental part of managing the fishery in British Columbia?
As the fishery is managed today, the test fishery provides key information that feeds management decisions that support the management process approved by the minister. So as the fishery is managed today, that information is very important to the day-to-day management of the fishery.
You mentioned a moment ago that if this funding wasn't continued, then an alternative plan for collecting this information would be required. Do you have a sense of what that alternative might be?
I think it would be fair to revert to the deputy's comment that we're in the process of doing that evaluation and looking at how the fishery will be managed for next year, and therefore what we would need to do to manage it, whether we would need to find alternative sources or ongoing sources for this funding, or whether we need to make adjustments to the management of the fishery. So all of those things would be taken into consideration.
So at this point, you have not made a recommendation as to how to proceed in the face of this sunsetting funding?
We're participating in the evaluation.
And you have not yet given your evaluation?
We work with folks at national headquarters and the evaluation team to provide advice that comes from all of us, which includes the advice of the region about the practical nature of the test fisheries.
And what is your view as how this should proceed?
We're engaged in a process of looking at a variety of alternatives, as we do when we evaluate any program, and my ultimate view will be informed by the process that we're currently engaged in.
So you have not yet formed a view, I take it, then, on what to do about maintaining this important fishery, test fishery, after March?
All of us are contributing to the evaluation from which all of us will learn from each other and provide recommendations about going forward.
Another funding issue on research relates to the Quailark Fish Enumeration Site. I think the evidence we have is that this was another project which was not to be funded through 2012, but that the PSC, the Pacific Salmon Commission, has stepped in. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. We do have an agreement with the Pacific Salmon Commission that the Quailark site will be funded through the 2012 season.
Yeah. So that's the extent of the commitment from the PSC?
That's the extent of the discussions at this time.
What is DFO doing for the long term, given it seems to be a pretty widely held view that this facility is significant to in-season management?
I think that goes in the context of the longer-term discussions, which Ms. Farlinger and Ms. Dansero just raised. So I think I'd have to perhaps defer to them. But the issue is really about, I guess, the future here, and at this point, we have a commitment through 2012.
Ms. Dansero, Ms. Farlinger?
I'd just say that the Quailark program that was run by DFO, and in fact is run by DFO this year based on Salmon Commission funding, has been and continues to be an experimental program. By and large, the views are that there are positive results from this program. We continue each and every year to review the evaluation of the escapement with the Mission program and with the Quailark program, and the long-term considerations have to take both those things into account. The extension of the program this year was fundamentally based on the concept that evaluation continues to need to be done, which is the contribution of Mission and the contribution of Quailark. And so that's one of the reasons the program was extended by the Pacific Salmon Commission this year.
Commission from both Mike Lapointe from the Pacific Salmon Commission and Brian Riddle, who both described this as critical and an essential site for the in-season management of the sockeye. Do you accept that advice?
There are a variety of views on the contributions of the Mission counting facility and Quailark. It continues to evolve. The Quailark facility continues to evolve, and we will, as we have every year for the last 4 or 5 years, continue to take the best information from both of those and make a solution for the following year in terms of how we assess the escapement of the stocks.
Given the focus on the in-river conditions with climate change and other changes, and the advice you're getting from people like Brian Riddle and Mike Lapointe, what is your view about the importance of Quailark?
My view is that there are a wide variety of views, and there's still questions about Quailark, and there are still questions about Mission, and each and every year we attempt to improve those things to make sure that we have the best possible escapement estimate. That is our objective in any given year, and we'll continue to use the methods, the best methods we can to make that escapement estimate.
Do I understand then from the evidence this morning that the decision on what to do about Quailark into the future is in the same time frame as the PICFI funding and the Rock test fishery funding? That is, it's in consideration now for a decision by March of 2012?
With respect to the actual in-season estimation, it may go slightly later than March 2012, but we'll have to have, as we have every year, the escapement estimation procedures and the various components of the management system in place prior to the approval of the integrated fishery management plan, which occurs late in the year, about June of the year. So I can't say specifically exactly when it will occur, but we will need to have those in place in order to manage the fishery next year.
Brent Hargreaves testified before the Commission that selective fishing is one of the most critical things we can still do in the salmon fisheries in British Columbia. He also said that there's been a lot of research on selective fishing since DFO's selective fishing program terminated in 2002. Do you agree, Ms. Farlinger, that selective fishing is a critical tool for salmon fisheries in the Pacific region?
Yes, I do.
And do you agree that there should be further research done on it?
The research program that was initiated in the CFAR funding was was focused on introducing an idea and funding research. Since that time, the department has, in this Pacific region, has focused on continuing those tests through the fishery management plans. So you will see, for example, the demonstration fisheries that have been conducted under the pig fee program. You will see very practical matters about the redistribution of allocation that results from non-selectivity of certain fisheries when weak stocks are passing. So it's very much a matter of practical implementation and continued testing through the fishery management regime at this point.
My question, I misquoted Dr. Hargreaves. His quote was that there has not been a lot of research in selective fishing since 2002. Are you suggesting that in fact there has been?
I'm intending to demonstrate that we are testing selective fishery measures through the implementation of the integrated fishery management plan, so that work continues to test selective measures. And in fact, the policy, selective fishing policy, is implemented through the reallocation that occurs when selective fishing measures limit the ability of a particular sector of the salmon fishery to take their allocation. So yes, I am saying that work is continuing. Whether you define it as research, we are looking at methods to practically implement it in the fishery. Whether fishermen can use different kinds of gears to avoid weak stocks, whether at the end of the season fish are reallocated to another gear sector because it is more selective than the original allocation. All of those things are very practical measures, and work focused very much on implementing the selective aspects of the salmon fishery.
One of the issues of where research is apparently not being done, according to Dr. Hargreaves, is the question of the long-term survival of bycatch as opposed to short-term. Do you agree that research is not going on?
There have been some projects focused on bycatch. One I can think of specifically is the recreational fishery for sockeye in the lower Fraser River, a project that looks specifically at release mortality. So I would say no, that research has not stopped, or that work has not stopped. It's not always research, sometimes it's projects, management projects. And I can't at this point give you an exhaustive list, but work does continue to evaluate selective measures for fishing, both in the commercial fishery and in the recreational fishery.
Well, on the specific issue of long-term survival of bycatch, is there research ongoing on that?
I would have to, other than the project I just described to you, which looks at survival of sockeye after it's been released by recreational fishermen, I'd have to ask Dr. Richards.
Yeah, I am not aware of any projects at this time, but most of these projects, as has just been mentioned, have been done as management projects rather than as scientific research. I think you appreciate that the department is a knowledge organization, and there is work that could be called research, which is done, which is outside of the science branch for which I'm responsible.
And this coming back to the lines of questions from yesterday, again, this sounds like learning by doing, learning by osmosis, a little ad hoc gaining of information, as opposed to a rigorous evaluative study of the issues that surround selective fishing. Is that fair?
No, I don't think it's fair. I think the project that I mentioned, for example, was rigorously evaluated. It's done by managers, carried out based on advice by science staff about how to carry out the study, how to evaluate the study. Science staff and resource management staff, while they may not be focused on a specific research project, work together in season to ensure that the kinds of studies we do are rigorous and can be evaluated.
And the study you're referring to is the one in the recreational fishery?
That's the one that came to mind at the moment.
Are you aware of any similar projects in the commercial fishery?
I did make reference earlier to some of the demonstration fisheries and some of the management actions that are implemented and tested each year in the fishery. And I also made reference to the fact that fisheries, which fundamentally implements the policy, fisheries are restricted because of the presence of weak stocks. And there are really a couple of different ways you avoid weak stocks and become selective. And one of those is to restrict the timing of the fishery to avoid the weak stocks. Another of those is to require the use of more selective gear. And there are different aspects of the commercial fishery and their gear that have been implemented and tested to reduce the catch of weak stocks, and those are evaluated. And the third thing, in fact, is to avoid the fishery that causes the interception at all, which is, so that's a continuum of activities that go on to implement selectivity of a fishery.
Is there someone in the Pacific region who is tasked with coordinating all of these efforts around selectivity and correlating and bringing together and evaluating all of the information arising?
I think it would be fair to say that science staff and management staff are involved in evaluating each of these measures and each of these projects, and evaluating how they can be implemented in following years, either over the long term or for the next annual management plan.
Is there an individual who is a champion of this, or who is coordinating all of this activity?
No.
You mentioned, and Mr. Bevan mentioned also, that without selective fishing, opportunities for fishing will not be there. Can you give me some examples, or any example, of where the issue of selective fishing has influenced the decision to make a fishing opportunity available or not?
I think if you look across the fishing opportunities that are provided to all the gears in the commercial fishery, and also to the recreational fishery, and to the First Nations food, social, and ceremonial fishery, there are limitations in time and gear that specifically apply to the avoidance of weak stocks. I could point perhaps to early Stuart sockeye, a stock that has been of concern for some time. Fisheries are avoided on that stock and are only provided when it's estimated in season that the escapement targets will be met, and the priorities of the allocation framework are then applied to that. Chum fishing, for example, is curtailed in the commercial fishery to avoid weak stocks, weak steelhead stocks from the Thompson River. There are numerous examples of the specific timing and allocation of fishing times, and therefore curtailment of fishing opportunities that are driven by the presence of weak stocks. Yes, fisheries are changed constantly to adjust to that.
The examples you've given are all for avoiding bycatch of weak stocks. And I, perhaps naively, had in my mind that selective fishing meant something different than simply fishing timing to avoid weak stocks, but rather a way to differentiate among stocks fishing at the same time through gear choices and that sort of thing. Those are the sorts of tests that I had in mind. Is there any examples of any fishery that's allowed if certain gear is being used, for example?
Yes, there are, and I did talk about a continuum of measures up to that sort of range from changing timing, right through changing gear, right through to closure of fisheries, and all the measures I'm talking about are on that continuum. I think you could point to the example of, for example, in the Lower Fraser, beach seining of pink salmon to avoid stocks of concern, rather than gill netting of pink salmon. I think you can look at gear changes or behavior or methodology changes in the seine fishery, for example, that provide for either the release or avoidance of stocks of concern. I think in each and every fishery you can come up with examples. I think there are changes to gill net gear that have to do with avoiding various stocks of concern when their fishery are prosecuted. So there are a variety of changes inherent in the management of the fishery and are specifically required of each fishery. And in the case of the beach seine fishery that I referred to, we operate these both in the Skeena and in the Fraser River. They are intended to avoid stocks of concern.
Let me move now to another issue, the issue of some areas of limited research that may be related to the decline of the Fraser sockeye, and we've heard a lot about research into the marine environment. And this I'd like to put to you, Ms. Dansereau, first. In 2009, the Fraser sockeye didn't return from the marine environment as expected, and a 2011 memorandum for you entitled Update on Factors Affecting the 2009 Fraser River Sockeye Return says in its summary that the poor return in 2009 was most likely related to poor conditions throughout the ocean migration of the sockeye, and climate/ocean conditions are also thought to be the most likely factors associated with the longer-term decline in Fraser sockeye. Given DFO's view on the importance of the marine environment on sockeye survival, why have scientists told us that there is very little known and little research underway on Fraser sockeye marine survival? We've heard from scientists throughout that little or nothing is being done in terms of research into marine survival yet. It's identified as both in the context of the 2009 serious decline and the overall decline over the last decade or so, 20 years.
I will defer to Dr. Richards to answer sort of on the priority setting of science, but as we've discussed over the past day or so, and you've heard for the past year, science evolves, science changes. As new information comes in, priorities shift, and so where we may have put our energies 5 years ago, we might put them in a different place now as more information becomes available. So it's all part of the priority setting exercise and a recognition that we have some ability to do research far off where the salmon go, but we also have very significant knowledge gaps as to even how to get that work started. But what I would do is take the advice of our scientists in terms of what the next best approach would be to start addressing some of those questions.
Dr. Richards?
Mr. Commissioner, I think I take objection to the statement. I think we have done a considerable amount of research in the marine environment. It is true we don't have a lot of answers, and it's true that work in this area is very, very difficult and very challenging. We're dealing with a very large ocean area. Access to work on that ocean area requires vessels. We have one trawler that we have been using, and probably almost half the time of that trawler has been spent focusing, or maybe half to a third of the time of the use of that trawler over the last probably decade has been spent on projects related to salmon overall. Now, and when I say salmon, we don't design our studies to focus in the marine environment on Fraser sockeye. We have to look at this in the much broader context of all salmonids. Where do all salmonids go when they enter the marine environment? But we have been spending, I think, considerable amount of our ship resources on trying to answer that question and trying to get a better understanding but it is very, very difficult and challenging to follow salmon at sea and to understand understand where they're going, and to really try to answer these questions on survival. In order to help us, we have been working internationally. We are part of the North Pacific Anadromous Fish Commission. In that context, we would work with our colleagues in that commission, in particular with the U.S., in trying to understand this process. They have also been active in trying to look at this question by using factors like archival tagging, where you're able to put a tag on a salmon and then recapture that salmon at a later time and be able to then track and figure out its position in the ocean, in the North Pacific Ocean. So we are in contact with them. We do have access to that information. We are also working in conjunction with others through Pisces, sort of gone silent here.
It's hard when it's not the actual acronym.
Yeah, I know. But I do know this organization very well, North Pacific Marine Science Organization. And in the context of that organization, there have been a number of studies that have been looking at the effect of climate changes in the North Pacific on the ocean variability, how that then relates to salmon as well as other fish. And so we have been very active in doing that, and there's some aspects of that organization right now where their focus for the next 10-year period is really going to be on how we can improve forecasting, how we can improve prediction of climate and the marine environment, and how that's going to then translate back into things like impacts on our fisheries resources. So while we have a lot of outstanding questions on this issue, we have been active in trying to gain access to that information, and we have been very active in that research area.
Yes, Mr. Bevan.
If I can just add a little bit to that, similar problems also were found in the North Atlantic with respect to survival of salmon at sea. And there was collaborative work done there with all the members of the North Atlantic Salmon Conservation Organization to try and pool resources to get to ask the questions of why marine survival of Atlantic salmon in the Atlantic had also shown declines. That work is ongoing. It's very expensive, as noted, to get ships at sea, so it's something that we have looked at as a collaborative international arrangement. And I would also note that in light of the common experiences in the North Pacific and the North Atlantic, there was a symposium here in Vancouver of the various salmon commissions to compare their information at the time as to why we were all seeing the same patterns of marine survival changes throughout the Northern Hemisphere.
Thank you, Mr. Bevan. If I may come back, Dr. Richards, you've given us a rundown of some of the things that are going on. I just want to tick off a few areas and ask whether or not there's any research going on in them. Is there any work going on currently at DFO to understand the timing entry into the Strait of Georgia for Fraser River stocks?
Yes. And I guess I have to say that the particular way you phrase the question is, it's not that we're doing a project with that particular focus on its research, but we certainly are doing projects which will help us try to address that information. I think I mentioned that we did initiate some work where we're looking at the health of juvenile salmonids in the Strait of Georgia, and as part of that project we are doing some repeat surveys, and that information, along with some additional survey work in the lower river, will give us some information on timing. But we're not having studies that are directed to answer specifically the timing, but we are doing work that will help us understand the timing as part of a broader research program.
Is any work being done to understand which stocks migrate on the west coast of Vancouver Island as opposed to through the Strait of Georgia?
Mr. Commissioner, the issue of which stocks go when, I think, is a very challenging research question. And I think there would be some interest in trying to, I think we appreciate the importance of getting some information on that topic. But again, it's a very challenging question in order to try to design studies to do that precisely. Some of the work I just mentioned will indirectly give us information on that. We do have surveys going on where we are catching juvenile salmonids. We have stock identification tools which will allow us to then trace those and look at those samples and try to figure out what stocks are in those specific samples that we can then go back and infer that kind of information. But again, we aren't planning studies to do that explicitly. There is a little bit of work I think that's going down this year, and it has gone on in conjunction with the Post, which will give us some information on that. But again, that's only for a limited sample size of the fish that we were able to, on which we were able to put tags.
And those are all hatchery fish, correct?
I'm sorry, I don't know precisely. I didn't think so.
Oh.
I don't think
Right.
so, but I'm not familiar with these precise details.
What work's been done on the life history of the Harrison River stock in the marine and estuary environment?
Okay, again, Mr. Commissioner, that's a very specific question, and we don't tend to do work on specific stocks of salmon. Obviously, there's been quite a great interest in the Harrison because of its different life history, but we would be getting that in conjunction with a broader project that we'd be looking at all salmonids in the Strait of Georgia. And all salmonids, not just sockeye either, right?
Is there any work being done on where Fraser River stocks go once they leave, sockeye stocks, once they leave the north end of Vancouver Island?
Again, that's part of the same answer. We do have some ongoing work that has been done under Dr. Mark Trudell, who has been doing some repeated survey work that would go north of, that would go along the west coast of Vancouver Island, north into Queen Charlotte Sound and further north. He will be doing some samples and collecting some information. So, and with that, we will be able to again get the stock identification from those samples and then have some of that information.
Am I correct that Dr. Trudell's work is not directed at sockeye?
Dr. Trudell's work is directed at more at salmonids in general, and I say all the work we're doing is looking more than just Fraser sockeye. We're doing projects that look at salmon in general, and obviously we have interest in what's going on with stocks of sockeye other than the Fraser stocks.
So all of your answers on the work that's being done relates to salmonids in general, and I think a number of your answers suggest that some information may be indirectly attained, but the research I suggested isn't being specifically directed.
We have, I mean, we need to do our work in a broad context. You know, obviously we're interested in what's going on with Fraser sockeye, but it's also very helpful if we can look at what's going on with Fraser sockeye in the context of what's going on with other stocks of sockeye and with other stocks of salmon in general, because the ability to compare and contrast is very powerful in science.
Where the stocks reside in their first year of marine life, whether they stay together and whether they reside in particular areas along the coast, mixed with other stocks or independently?
Well, I think the studies that I just mentioned will give us some of that information, indirectly, but we will be trying to get information on that. We'll also be getting information on their growth. And from the repeated samples, we may be able to infer some information on survival, although that's a little less clear. But we will be looking at all of the information that we get from those, including the stock composition.
Is Canada doing any research on the impacts on the Fraser stocks of hatchery-released fish in the Gulf of Alaska?
Let me try to understand your question. I think your question is whether there's some kind of competition going on between hatchery stocks and other stocks of salmonids in the Gulf of Alaska generally.
That's been suggested.
Certainly there has been a lot of interest in that question within the North Pacific Anadromous Fish Commission. in the past, there have been, I think, a number of scientific symposia where that kind of theme has been raised. But again, the North Pacific Ocean is extremely challenging and difficult place to work. And we would like to be doing more there, but we're really limited in what we physically can actually do in that area and how you can actually design those kinds of experiments. So, if we're in there, in the North Pacific sampling, we will collect samples. We'll be able to do the stock composition. So we will know whether those are wild or hatchery stocks from the stock identification information. We hope. But, and then it would have to be more inferential from there. But it's not a situation where we're really able to do really direct experiments. And we know it's a question, and we'd be interested in looking at it. But these are really hard questions.
I appreciate that, but the evidence that the Commissioner shared is that this seems to be the area of most concern.
It certainly is an issue that has been raised. It's an issue of which we're aware, but there are some of these questions where we just, the answer is, even though we would like to study them, to design an experiment, to be able to go there and actually look at that is very, very difficult. Certainly we have tried to look at those kinds of questions and work with our international colleagues to try to answer those questions to the best we can with the data. But again, it's very, very difficult to really design an experiment or collect those data because it's very, very difficult to do anything in the middle of the North Pacific Ocean.
Let me just canvass for a minute the concept of just how hard it is and whether or not there are some avenues that have not been explored that might be. Dr. Tim Parsons testified. He's the professor emeritus at the Department of Earth and Ocean Sciences at UBC, and he testified that there are technologies available that might well be useful. And here's what he said: there are new instruments, gliders that go 1,000 miles into the ocean and come back with all kinds of data. We've talked about satellites. There's electronic tagging, the Argo float program. And best of all for me would be a satellite that could measure the amount of I never get this word right, diatoms in the sea. If we have those data coming in, we can make a diagnosis that the ocean really does look good for salmon this year. Are you aware of these technologies? Have you looked into them to do some of this difficult at-sea research?
Okay, that's a much more general question, and your previous question was a very specific question.
Yes.
Okay, in terms of this more general question, absolutely. We are very aware of these technologies, and we are working on some of those. In fact, Canada was one of the major promoters of the Argo program and was one of the major instigators to get that and get set up. We now have over 3,000 robotic floats peppered throughout the world's oceans. We've had that information now for a couple of years, and that's suddenly a tremendous wealth of data that we're getting on the physical properties of all oceans of the world, which will be very helpful for us in understanding things, feeding into questions on climate change and perhaps making longer-term weather forecasts more likely. So we're very aware of that information, and we are certainly wanting to, and some of our scientists are in fact leading some of those projects. So yes, we are very much aware of those technologies and using them to the extent that we can.
One of the issues which has been mentioned, and it came up again today, is the limited ability and the expense of dedicated ship time and trawlers. And I understand DFO has in the design work a research vessel which is in the planning stage. What investigation has DFO done to see whether or not there are other ways of collecting data? For example, using people who are there in any event, volunteers, or perhaps on a contract basis, ships that are traveling to an area where there's information that would be useful to you?
I mean, I think it very much depends on the kind of question that you're asking. If you're asking about questions about more generic oceanography and questions about what's out there in the food chain, We do have some other things. We are, in fact, using some ships of opportunity on one of the program. We have a continuous plankton recorder program where we have an installation that has been on sort of cargo ships that have been going back and forth across the Pacific Ocean, and we have been getting over it's over a 10-year period now information that is useful in looking at some of the plankton community in the surface layers in the North Pacific Ocean. And we're now at a point where we can start to analyze some of those data and look at some of the changes in both space and time changes within the plankton communities, which is part of the food chain that will be for salmon. So that is one place where we're able to do that in terms of the broader North Pacific Ocean. We are very much through Pisces, through the North Pacific Marine Science Organization, engaged with our colleagues in the U.S. The U.S. obviously have a big interest in what's going on in the Gulf of Alaska, in the North Pacific Ocean, and also in the Bering Sea. And so we are certainly working with them in various different working groups under different organizations so that we can stay current on some of this information, and that we can then use that in terms of our thinking and project design. So there is a lot of work that's going on there, and we are using some of these tools. We're using satellite technologies. Satellites does depend on the fact that we can actually see the surface of the ocean, and clouds are a problem with satellites. Unfortunately, the North Pacific tends to be cloudy a lot of the time, so it is a bit limited. But we certainly are aware of those other technologies, and we'll use them to the extent that we can.
Have you sought advice from your scientists as to the sort of opportunistic projects that might be available?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think scientists in general are very good at coming up with those kinds of ideas and finding examples of partnerships and being aware of what else is going on in the scientific community so that they can engage, and that we have an opportunity to leverage some of the work that we're doing with work that other partners are doing.
We've, in the course of this commission, have asked researchers about their priorities in terms of marine area research, and some answers have been received. Dr. Beamish and David Welsh prioritized estimating stock abundance of juvenile salmon fish leaving the Fraser estuary. Dr. Beamish described this as invaluable and its highest priority. Have you asked your scientists for their priorities on marine research and been provided with advice?
I have asked my scientists for their ideas on a lot of research areas, and I have advice from them, and I do look at that advice, but I need to take that in conjunction with the kind of management questions which my colleagues are going to pose to me, and then also, and so it all needs to be prioritized.
Indeed, and so between the advice from your scientists and the instructions or advice from management, what are your marine or the sciences marine environment research priorities?
Well, I think I can tell you, I mean, some of the work that we're currently doing, and we are, and it's a little bit difficult for me to answer this question directly because there's a lot of work that we are doing which some might consider monitoring more than research. And a lot of the work and a lot of the work that we do is really perhaps more monitoring. So if I think of the work and the studies that Dr. Beamish and Dr. Trudell have done, they are collecting long-term survey data, and that information makes sense a lot of the time in the context of when you have a long-term data series. So you compare what happened and answer this year with past years to give you a sequence and trend. So a lot of the work is really trying to get base monitoring data, and then we try to leverage those opportunities with other kinds of more perhaps sort of research questions. And so it's really, I think the point is we have some ships that are out there doing this monitoring. We need to continue to do those monitoring projects to the extent that that's practical. What else can we be doing? And can we be getting it? Are there any other samples? Should we be leveraging that with some other oceanographic data? Those are the kinds of things that we would be looking at.
Can you be more specific about what priorities you're pursuing in marine research? And I include monitoring in that.
Okay, well, I think our program on marine research is, like everything else we do, is focused much more broadly than just Fraser sockeye. So we do have programs that are looking at the oceanography of the North Pacific Ocean. We do have some long-term survey series. For example, we have been going out to Line P in the middle of the North Pacific Ocean. That's for over 50 years, and the fact that we've been able to maintain that program over that long period of time is now giving us a wealth of data that we're able to look and then compare with what's happening today. What are the water properties today with what were the water properties 50 years ago? And then what is that perhaps then telling us about the future? We are very involved in the Argo project that we just mentioned, that again is bringing us a wealth of scientific information. We would certainly, intend to the extent possible continue some of the routine surveys that we're doing that provide us the base monitoring of salmon and other similar surveys where we're looking at monitoring of groundfish in different parts of the coast, because those sort of fundamentally fit into the kinds of advice that we will need to be providing to our fishery managers. And then we would use those as opportunities to collect other data that could vary a little bit from time to time, depending on the priorities of the day.
Are managers also telling you that more research and monitoring is required in the marine environment?
The managers are more likely to ask us more sort of directed questions about providing advice on the status of stocks. And it's really, the monitoring is a way that we are able to provide that information to them on the status of stocks.
And this is marine?
Marine and in the case of salmon, that also would apply to the escapement enumeration and estimates on the spawning grounds, which are also extremely important in getting that information.
Issues that was identified in the memorandum in 2009 to the minister and repeated in the 2011 advice to you, Ms. Dansreau, were harmful algal blooms, and that these toxic algal blooms was listed as a factor that could have led to the sockeye mortality at the level observed in 2009. Dr. Richards, so the 2011 memo continues to list the toxic algal blooms as a concern. However, we've heard that the Pacific region of DFO is not doing any research on this topic. Why is that?
Shall I answer?
Yeah, I think it's directed.
Okay.
Please, Dr. Richards.
Well, there was a decision that was made in one of our previous round of funding reductions that we would not continue to do research on some toxic algal work. So that, and in fact, as we look at that back, I mean, we have to make choices as we go through, and we have to make choices about what to continue and not to continue. And this was a decision that was made in the context of the previous national review that was about 5 years ago, that would be one thing that we would not continue doing in terms of the pure research in that area. And all these things have to be made and looked in the context of the risk and what are the potential consequences. Certainly our focus has been on fish, and we have not been aware, certainly we're aware that there are toxic algal blooms, but we haven't been aware that there were concerns with toxic algal blooms related to wild fish populations. And I think the evidence that you did hear already, Mr. Commissioner, from Jack Rensel would indicate that while that information is suggestive, it's not still definitive that there was a link. So it's a possibility, but but the question was rarely related to research. There is still some monitoring that goes on, and there are some things that we are doing. We are able to get some of that information from satellites. So we do have some satellite information which we have been looking at, which has been following some blooms. So we're able to look at blooms not just of toxic algae, but also of other algae blooms, because there's other kinds of diatom blooms that are also perhaps of interest. That is a bit limited, as I mentioned, by the fact that it's often cloudy in the summer, so we can't get precise information on that, but we do get some information on that. Given this interest in this program, we were able to, I think, collect some samples this summer, which will be analyzed by Vancouver Island University. So we are trying to collaborate and work in cooperation with others and trying to leverage some of our opportunities, some of our sampling opportunities to work with others. So there is some information that we're getting, although we don't have a directed program.
The decision not to fund research into toxic algal blooms was made, I think, in 2006. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, I don't recall the precise number, but it was around that, or its precise date, but it was around that time.
Mr. Lund, could we have Commissioner's Document 22, please, which is the 2009 memorandum. It's Exhibit 616A. The bottom of the page says the following factors could possibly have led to sockeye mortality on the scale observed, and the first identified as toxic algal blooms in the Strait of Georgia. That was in 2009. That same heightened level of interest was in the memo of this year to the Deputy Minister. In that context, I guess I'm confused as to why this hasn't been increased in importance in things that DFO is studying.
I think it's in part a question of what is meant by additional work. Some of the work and some of the programs that have been done on toxic algae were really done in the context of human health and concerns related to human health. And so that is not an area that is currently a consideration for us. That's really an avenue for other departments, not our department. So that's what the old research had been, was really focused on that kind of topic. So I think it's a question is really sort of what is meant by research and a research program specifically. In this case, we certainly were aware that others, in particular Jack Rensel, had information on this topic, and I think in this, we don't feel like we need to do everything ourselves within the department. Where there are others who have data and working on that, we will try to stay informed on this and try to work with them to the extent possible. But we don't really feel like it's really necessary for the department to do absolutely everything.
Dr. Rensel's work is not in the Strait of Georgia, is it?
No, I think it was mostly in Puget Sound.
So the issue's been identified. The Strait of Georgia is right at hand. Why would you not have pursued it?
Well, as I mentioned, this past summer we have collected some samples, and we are trying to work in conjunction with Vancouver Island University and others. But but again, there are other. I think it's a question of, even if we pursue it in the context here, where would it really be going in terms of the management advice? What would we be doing? How would that? I think this is really a question we're looking at feeding into how we would then provide advice back to management. I think in our view that there are other avenues which would be more informative to our advice to management than this particular topic. It's not that it's not a possibility, it's just that even if it were a possibility, what we could do about it is really more limited rather than some of those other questions.
Well, Dr. Rensel did testify that there may well be mitigative measures that can be taken on toxic algal blooms, so presumably there is some management advice that could flow from this.
That may be, but I think that would not be the kind of work that we would be involved with in terms of the Fisheries and Oceans Canada. So we need to be focused on the things that are really within our control and mandate.
Okay, so nobody is studying this in British Columbia at the moment, and do I take it that it's not considered a priority, even though it was identified as recently as a month or two ago as being a significant possibility for the long-term decline of the Saugeen?
I think we are, as I mentioned, we are still getting some information, and it's not that we're not doing, we are doing some work here. We are collecting some samples on this. We are doing some monitoring. So we are collecting some information. It's just that we do not have a targeted research program on this particular topic. But we are working with others. We are getting some information.
And how is this information being used? Is there somebody responsible for coordinating this research and advancing our level of knowledge on this issue?
On toxic algae in particular?
Yes.
I guess I'd have to answer no. There's no specific person involved with this, but we are. There are certainly a couple of people that I would use to direct questions on this issue. One of which would be Mr. Robin Brown. The other, Mr. Mark Saunders.
Mr. Commissioner, it's 11:15. Would this be a convenient time to break?
And what time remaining do you have, Mr. Wallace?
By my estimate, 45, half an hour.
Thank you.
Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes.